Well, we've talked about risk communication and the definitions of risk communications. I'm going to zero in on risk. R-I-S-K, risk. A small word, but a very complex meaning. We use risk, each of us use risks in our language in different ways. We say, what is the risk of foodborne illness like E. coli? And as a scientist or a public health worker, I might respond and say, well, the risk of E. coli is approximately 1 chance in 10 million meals. Or the risk of E. coli is 10 chances in 100,000 people per year. Well, how about if I approach to ask the question of what is the risk of a terrorist attacking our food supply? Now, again, while we might say that chance is 1 in a billion or 1 in a trillion or 1 in every 15 years, we also think about what are the costs and what are the implications. Well, what type of attack would that be? And what would that mean to us? Well, scientists tend to think of risk in terms of the probability that something will happen. But you know what? Most of us, all of us in fact, interpret risk to mean far more than simply 1 in a million. Risk is all about what can go wrong, how likely it would happen, the consequences if it should happen, and lastly and most importantly, how we as individual human beings will subjectively evaluate the relative importance of that event. So you know what, I tie this all together, I can't tell you what your perception of risk is. Because if I gave all of you watching this the same scientific information, I described the organism, and I talked about the route of administration, and I talked about the likelihood of illness, and I talked about whether or not that illness might precipitate death. And then I asked each of you to describe that risk. You would each describe it in a slightly different way, because risk is a very, very personal thing. Each of us evaluates risk differently. Whether it's the decision about wearing a motorcycle helmet or clipping our seatbelt or smoking a cigarette, each of us evaluates risk on a very individual, from a very individual perspective.